Hi, I'm Tony Russo, and this is Funeral Service Insider, conversations worth having about the culture and business surrounding end-of-life care. This week, we are speaking with Alexandra Mosca. She is a funeral director and a writer of some note. She's been contributing to American Funeral Director for some time, and she's written a bunch of books, and it's hard to find a story that comes out that she hasn't tackled somehow. It's always a pleasure to see her, whether she's written in our magazine or in another periodical. And we're going to get to her in just a second. But first, this word from our sponsor, Matthews International. For more than 20 years, Matthews Aurora Funeral Solutions has been providing innovative technology to support funeral professionals and their families. Their Arranger presentation system makes showcasing service and merchandise options simple. Family Connections technology enables families to participate in arrangement planning from the comfort of home. And the Advisor system combines case management and interactive planning, all in one place. Simplify the arrangement process with technology designed for you. Visit MatthewsAurora.com for a free demo or call 1-800-457-111 today. That's MatthewsAurora.com or 1-800-457-1111. Call today. So I think before we get too far into things, I'd like to talk about how you got into funeral service. So what drew you to funeral service as a vocation? Because I know that writing was also on your mind.
Well, from the time I was a child, I intended to be a writer someday. I never had any thoughts of becoming a funeral director. I doubt anybody did, except children of funeral directors perhaps at the time. But an after-school job in a funeral home when I started college changed the course of my life. I was really intrigued, as many people are, about death and what goes on in a funeral home. I mean, after all, death is the great unknown. We're all curious. Plus, it was a time when women were truly a rarity in funeral service. So after a few years of working there, I said, I think I'm going to go to mortuary school. But it was such a different time that when I told my boss about my plans, he said, "Who would hire you?" Then it became a challenge, and it was one I was determined to meet.
Now, can I get you to go back a little bit? So where were you in school, and where were you as so you were working as a funeral assistant then?
Yes, I was a receptionist. I was in college in Queens County, New York, and I worked in a funeral home in Bayside, which is in Queens. And so every day after school, I would go to the funeral home and work the visitation. And I worked there for a number of years. I actually worked in a couple of funeral homes throughout college. And then after college ended, I went into McAllister.
Do you remember was there a, I don't want to say like clouds opening kind of moment, but when were you like, oh no, this is what I need to do professionally?
I think it was more gradual, little at a time. I also, and I mean, this is really the truth, we used to get American Funeral Director magazine, and I couldn't wait to read it. And that intrigued me as well, hearing about funeral directors across the country.
What were you writing at the time? Like in college, like how much writing were you doing? Not only just freelancing, but also just kind of personal writing and things.
Well, at the time, I wasn't writing for publication. I was majoring in English, and I was doing my assignments, but I was always keeping a diary of sorts, and I was keeping notes about what it was like to work in a funeral home. That increased, of course, when I actually became a resident several years later. But I had kept notes from the beginning.
And do you ever revisit them? Do you ever send them, use them for your work today?
Well, I used my notes to write a book. I mean, they were very helpful when I wrote my first book, which was a memoir called Grave Undertakings, about what it was like to be a funeral director at the time I began, when you hardly ever saw a female face.
And when did that come out?
That came out in 2003.
Let's talk about that process real quick, only because you are a funeral director, and again, at the turn of the century, funeral directors didn't have personas, I guess, the way that they have them now. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Like today, it seems like something many funeral directors would be happy to do. But at the time, it must have been a little daunting.
To do the book, well, I have to say, I did get some criticism and pushback. But in fact, I was very complimentary about funeral service. It was more about the experience. And it was a little rough at the time as a woman because we were really just breaking into funeral service. We weren't accepted by everybody at the time. But I always felt like I wanted to play ball and I wanted to be accepted by proving myself.
Instead of by going like hard against the grain.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because the people I did work with were always very kind to me. I just think they were so used to seeing a male that it was a little hard to accept the changes, but they did.
When you went for your first job, how was the writing affected by that?
Well, when I went for my first job, that was really difficult. That was my apprenticeship. When I got out of American Academy McAllister, that was the hardest thing to find a funeral home that would take me. And I went, what it seemed like at the time, everywhere. I called everybody, and they were not hiring women until I got very lucky and a husband, wife. A team hired me in Queens in a funeral home where I worked for about 5 years learning the business. And that's where I really made a lot of notes, notes that I still have today because I had wonderful bosses who really taught me well.
And can you tell me their names, the people you worked for?
Sure. John Cox and Ray Migliori, they were husband and wife who owned the funeral home together. And Ray was actually a licensed funeral director, but at the time she was raising her young child, so John was really running the funeral home. But they were really the best teachers I could have had. I mean, as difficult as it was to find a job, when I found it, I found the right one.
Did Ray give you any particular advice that was like woman centric, I guess, for at the time?
She did. She said, "Toughen up, honey."
And why did she have cause to say toughen up,
Well,
honey? Or
she felt that she said, "You have to be twice as strong as any man in this industry. You have to work twice as hard to be accepted." She said, "It's not an easy go for a woman." And I believe she was right, and she really helped me by giving me this kind of advice.
and when your time there was over, how did you leave because you were able to get another opportunity because your time there was out? What was the first transition like?
I left there because I wanted to be on my own, essentially. I wanted to I hang a license and I have a registered business, and I also help other colleagues, but I wanted to be free to handle my own funerals and my time. I wanted it to be my own, essentially.
It's interesting. I just spoke with a young man who's becoming a funeral director, and he was talking about the difference between going to mortuary school and what those expectations are, and what and what the expectations are from funeral home to funeral home because he's working at a couple, and what he said about his excitement about eventually getting his funeral director's license is he gets to decide what's important to him when
Mhm.
he's serving families. Like right now, he has to do things the other director's way, but eventually he'll have his own families and he can make his own tweaks. When you were kind of coming up, did you see that? Was that something that was
I
apparent to
did
you?
see that, but luckily I was trained by, as I said, 2 wonderful directors, so I felt capable of doing these funerals on my own.
So how did that work at the time? Again, hanging just kind of hanging your shingle as it were at another funeral home. How did you set that up?
It was actually originally at the funeral home that I worked at. So I was registered out of their business, and then later I transferred to another funeral home. And then I advertised, I networked. I also wrote a little column in the local newspaper. It was called Ask Alexandra, and I answered questions about funeral service. So I tried to get my name out there for people who might call me. And eventually they did, and then it became word of mouth.
That's so there are two things there because I definitely want to talk about how you got the column, but how again what you're doing now what you're doing then is common-ish now. How common was it then
It
to
it
be
was not common. It was not common then. I think that if anybody's read my book, Grave Undertakings, they would see how really, really hard it was at the time. And I'm not complaining about it. I'm just saying what was. It was a different era. People just didn't, they were not receptive. And not only being a woman, but youth is not such an asset in this business. When you're very young, they're really looking for somebody a little older because sometimes when I was working at the funeral home where that I was talking about, families would come in and I would be making arrangements with them and they would look at me and say, "Oh, is there a grown up here?" or something like that. And I was appalled and I felt bad, of course. But when I got older, I understood. They thought I was just a kid. And I was in my 20s, early 20s at the time. And I just thought, gee, I mean, how old do I have to be before they accept me? So I had two things going against me. But then, like a lot of young people, it takes a while. So you become seasoned and experienced, and then it changes.
Well, and because people also they're looking for an old man is what they is what they were
I
kind of
think they're looking
expecting.
for somebody who's paternal, essentially. But now I think they've changed their thinking, and they're very happy when they see a female director.
And of course, eventually they may have known you from your column. So how did you get the column? That's there are still some funeral directors who do that, and that's something that I feel like unfortunately has kind of gone by the wayside.
Look, it was fine because I went to my local paper and proposed it, and they were receptive. And I enjoyed doing that because, of course, I wanted to write no matter what I was writing about. And I would get letters from the community. And when I didn't get letters, I'd ask my friends to write letters and pose some questions. This is before email, of course.
Right.
And it would always be a topic that I thought would help a lot of people, not just, a random question, but something that really touched on a lot of things that were going on in funeral service at the time.
And I guess one of the other upsides that allowed you to get the writing done was you had, for lack of a better term, better control of your own schedule than, I mean, you didn't have control over when the phone rang, but you had control over everything else.
No, it was much better that way for me. It worked for me, though I was always on call, no matter whether I was working for a funeral home. And over the years, I did take some jobs in funeral homes. At the same time, I worked for myself. I did both. So I was on call for a lot of places, but I somehow managed. I mean, I get up at 5 in the morning so I can write for a few hours every morning before I leave.
And that's a habit that's stuck your entire career.
Yes, yes, it has. That's the best time to write.
I absolutely agree. I get up very early myself for the same reason, because once people know you're up, they have
That's
questions for
right.
you.
They're calling, etc.
Oh, did you ever? I'm sorry, you must have. Do you recall any time when you were writing and you got a call and you had to stop and go?
Absolutely. And of course, it breaks your concentration, etc. But that's my priority, being there for a family. So, of course, I was glad to do it.
And as you're doing the writing, did it ever affect? Not affect. Was it ever a concern of any of the employers maybe that you had, or anything like that?
Do you mean that they'd find something offensive or?
Yeah, maybe they didn't like your column or like that you had a column. Was that?
No, I think that they were actually very supportive at the time because it was really simply answering questions. Later on, when I wrote the book, I did have to get permission from anybody that I mentioned at any length in the book.
Right.
And people were pretty good about that. But I kept confidences. I only really wrote about things that affected me.
And right, and that was to serve the idea of like, this is what happened to me. It wasn't about it wasn't a critique
Yeah,
of
of the industry,
funerals.
no, not at all.
Your book was before or after you started writing for American Funeral Director. How did you end up writing for American Funeral Director?
Well, I have to say, it will be 27 years in May
Wow.
since I first began writing for Kates-Boylston. It was really serendipity how that came about. I had sent a letter. Again, we were still writing letters. It was 1998, and Ed Deffert was the editor at the time, and I was seeking some information. And Ed called me and he said, "We happen to be putting together an issue about women in funeral service." And he asked me if I wanted to write something. And I said, "I sure do." And I was just so excited to be asked. And my article became the cover story that month. And my professional relationship with Kates-Boylston continued from there.
For more than 20 years, Matthews Aurora Funeral Solutions has been providing innovative technology to support funeral professionals and their families. Their Arranger presentation system makes showcasing service and merchandise options simple. Family Connections technology enables families to participate in arrangement planning from the comfort of home. And the Advisor system combines case management and interactive planning, all in one place. Simplify the arrangement process with technology designed for you. Visit MatthewsAurora.com for a free demo or call 1-800-457-111 today. That's MatthewsAurora.com or 1-800-457-1111. Call today. Can you talk about how you pitch stories? Because you don't just write for Kates-Boylston, you write all over the place. So can you, as a regular freelance writer, it's always interesting to hear how people pitch and how they decide who to pitch to and things like that.
Well, one of the things for me, and I've been really lucky about this, because they say write what you know. And there's so many wonderful writers out there, as you know. And I thought, what can I offer that other people may not be offering? And I found a way, of course, to incorporate my career as a funeral director with my writing. So a lot of my writing, even when I'm writing for a newspaper or an online magazine, does have to do with funeral service or cemeteries.
But you also publish across different
I do.
publications.
I write about women's issues as well, but I query, like everybody else, I'll send out queries to magazines, newspapers, etc., online or in print. And that's it's a hard way to go. You don't always get somebody to say yes to you.
No, I'm familiar.
I mean, that's one of the hardest ways to make a living.
It's a brutal way, only because you really have to have a thick enough skin to hear no constantly.
You absolutely do. I was thinking the same thing. But I understand, but I've been lucky in the times that people have been receptive. It's been so gratifying. I became interested in cemeteries as a result of my career as a funeral director. I would be in a cemetery looking around after the burial, and I would see stones that were so intriguing. I was sometimes blown away by the brevity of some lives. They were just so short. And other times I would read some kind of inscription. It was very profound or very moving. And I would say, I want to know more about these people. And I would go home and research them. And a lot of this became an article. I mean, that's where I got a lot of ideas just walking through the cemetery.
Well, yeah, it's writing about cemeteries takes I Contain Multitudes to a whole new level.
Well, you know what they say about cemeteries, though? They're outdoor museums, and I think that's really true. A lot of the names that I've researched or come across have been names from history when we were children or we were learning about the history of America. Greenwood and Woodlawn cemeteries in New York are two examples of that.
Yes, and it's unfortunate how rich they are, because it makes other cemeteries hard to. We just ran a story, I guess, last month or the month before. Like, what do you do if you don't have a cemetery full of famous people?
Well, I'll tell you something. You're always going to find somebody. I mean, there are people that you don't even realize. And it's easier to research now because you can go through the old newspaper archives and you put in a name. All of a sudden, something will pop out and you'll be like, oh, my goodness, I didn't realize that person was whoever they were.
Right. And if you didn't know it, as someone who's interested, it's an opportunity to share it more widely.
Yes, and I love to do that. I think every person has a story. I feel that way in the funeral home, and then I feel that way when I'm walking through a cemetery writing about somebody. I once went to visit an elderly lady in a nursing home. She was very sweet. I sat and spoke with her for a little while, but she told me a little about her life, but not a whole lot. But I said to myself, this woman is very interesting. I want to come back and see her again. And then when I did come back, she was in about 90, 91 at the time. She passed, and I really felt bad because I wanted to get her to know her. So I wanted to know who handled the funeral, if there was any family, if I could send a card. So I look her up, and I find out that she was the first employee of one of the big hospitals on Long Island here. And I'm like, oh my goodness. Like, she never told me that in our conversation, but she really was somebody. So I called the funeral home they handled the funeral, and I said to them, did people come? And they said, yes, people from the hospital came. People knew her. They hung up the coat that she wore there. And I actually included her in a story at some point about a cemetery in which she was buried.
One of the privileges, I think, of writing is you get to memorialize people alive and dead in ways that they normally wouldn't be. Like, one of my favorite things is I love writing about not famous people.
Uh-huh.
It's just like the height of what I feel like I can do, because every life is worth talking about. And, there's just the problem is just time and space. The problem is
Definitely.
the problem is never ideas, right? Or who to talk to. But there's something really gratifying in saying this life was important and I can take the time to tell people why.
I couldn't agree more. In fact, the same thing with cemetery monuments. Sometimes a monument to a non-famous person is more interesting, more grand than of a famous person.
Because it took more to get it done.
Eh, For one thing, but also because you might expect that from somebody who was famous in their time. But when you see something like there's up in Gate of Heaven in Westchester, I once came across a monument that just stopped me in my tracks. It was like an outside gazebo, and I'm like, it's so unusual. You really have to see a photo of it to appreciate it. But I'm saying, what is this? Who is this for? And it turned out that it was a memorial to a young man who died in the earthquake in San Francisco in 1989. His family was the Stelladoro Company. And I thought, wow, like, he's not famous, but the family must have been so, just uh, grief stricken and shocked about what happened that they put up this memorial to him. It was therapeutic, I think, I'm sure, in some ways for him. And they had a little inscription that said, if he who has the most fun wins the game of life, Mark was triumphant. And I remember seeing this and thinking, wow, this is really something. It meant so much to them to keep his memory alive in this way. You can't miss it in the cemetery.
Hmm.
So those kind of things always strike me.
Do you ever find yourself bailing on a story because it's just either not working out, or you find out that, I don't know, the person was too unpleasant or not unpleasant enough, or anything
I,
like?
I haven't had that happen, Tony, and I've actually had difficulty a few times with this story for just different reasons. I couldn't get the information I was looking for, but I'm kind of a trooper, so I'll stick with it. I may hold it for 6 months, but I'll get it done at some point.
That's it. That's another thing we have in common. Somebody will say, "You're going to get a story out of it," and I'm like, "Well, I went. If I went, then there was at least the story of me going. But yeah,
That's right.
if I go, then there's a story there for sure." You had sent me a couple of articles to look at, and one of the ones that I wanted to talk about a little bit was the one for the Saturday Evening Post
Hmm.
about tradition, because, and especially now this is, now it's an older story, but it's still relevant. The idea of regular funerals, let's say regular in quotes, still taking the time to have a funeral.
That was one of my favorite articles to write. I wrote that in 2018. And I was trying to say that funerals matter, and they still matter. And people always ask me, what was my favorite funeral? Because in addition to
Mm.
conducting funerals, I write about famous funerals. And I was just actually talking about this yesterday with some friends. My favorite funeral was the 2013 funeral of New York City Mayor Ed Koch. And people say, why? And I said, it had all the elements of a good funeral. It was a mix of tribute, tears, laughter, and there was a body present. And I think the shared um, sense of loss at the temple that day, uh, and so many people were there for him. He was quintessential New York, and the way he was honored was just so touching and moving. and it helped New Yorkers heal and mourn together.
I grew up in New Jersey during the 70s and 80s, and his face comes immediately to mind. You say Ed Koch, pow, right? There's no, oh, who was that guy?
Yeah, no, he was really something for New York.
We had a little conversation earlier about the changing kind of, you know, not interest, but coverage of, because I do a lot of coverage, as I said, of like green burials and things like that. And although it gets a lot of press, it doesn't always get a lot of traction with families. And that's an interesting disconnect.
Funerals, what I see, they're being played for entertainment in many ways.
Hmm.
And I don't really understand why. I don't know why that's what people want to read. We're not reading about people who are really doing good work. Patty Barchi, who's the executive editor of Kates-Boylston, she's given me a few assignments that I've just loved to do because it poses a question about funeral service, and then 6 to 10 funeral directors will weigh in with their stories. And I've loved doing this because I feel like it's a way to get my colleagues who are not always heard from, they don't get a chance to speak, and now I can hear their stories and what they want to tell me or share with our readers. And that's the people that I think these people should be speaking for funeral service. They know what funeral service is. They work in funeral service every day. When I read an article in the newspaper, I'm thinking, who wrote this? And what is this about? This is not reflective of any funeral service I know.
It's so true. I do a weekly, kind of like a weekly news video, and usually about a third of it is just a critique of consumer media on funerals. Like, because one of the things that I like to do is say, this is what people are saying, and how do we stop them? I guess, I guess is not the question I'm asking you, but that's kind of the issue for me is these things get up into popular culture, and there's nothing wrong with popular culture except that, you're going to get the calls and people are going to say, well, what about this? And you're going to say, well, you know, yes, we can human compost you, and here's what it's going to cost to fly you to Washington, and here's what it's going to cost to fly you back, and all of those things. And it's not as simple as it's made out to be a lot of times. And then funeral directors are kind of put in a position of justifying words that they never spoke.
I think that some people have asked me about, for instance, composting or green burial, etc. But I think it's more a curiosity. And then once they get an answer, they go on to asking questions about a more traditional service.
I am kind of coming up against it, and I want to make sure that I get everything that I ought to. So before I let you go, is there something I should have asked and didn't, or something that you thought you'd get the opportunity to say and I didn't provide it, or something you wanted to talk about and I didn't go that way?
I think that one of the things as a funeral director, and I would be curious to hear what other funeral directors have to say, is how we can be more, not transparent because I think we are, but how we can let people know that we're still here for them, still doing the work that, we were trained to do to help them transition, to help them have the support and comfort at a funeral, for a funeral to be what was meant to be. How do we get that message out in a way where social media is making, as I said, some kind of entertainment out of what we do and what we've put our hearts and soul in? I would be curious about what other funeral directors think about that. I mean, perhaps you could do a show one day about that and ask us how we can get the public to understand that we're still doing what we've done for hundreds of years, since funeral service was started.
Well, and that's the flip side of social media, because I think that a lot of times people believe that people need to be tricked into watching, tricked into seeing, tricked into paying attention. Like, how do I get your attention? And then how do I tell you the thing, instead of just how do I tell you the thing, you know? Or was that too
Yeah,
open?
yeah, no, I know what you're saying, but I think there's a more straightforward way for us to do it because I think the average family wants to know that we're here for them, and it's not entertainment, it's very serious, it's not amusing, it's none of those things. when you have a loss in your life, you're looking for somebody who's going to be a rock for you and somebody who's going to be respectful and empathetic, not somebody who's looking to entertain their followers on social media.
Excellent. Well, that's all I have for you then, and thank you so much for your time.
And thank you, Tony.
For more than 20 years, Matthews Aurora Funeral Solutions has been providing innovative technology to support funeral professionals and their families. Their Arranger presentation system makes showcasing service and merchandise options simple. Family Connections technology enables families to participate in arrangement planning from the comfort of home. And the Advisor system combines case management and interactive planning, all in one place. Simplify the arrangement process with technology designed for you. Visit MatthewsAurora.com for a free demo or call 1-800-457-111 today. That's MatthewsAurora.com or 1-800-457-1111. Call today. Funeral Service Insider, the podcast, is a Kates-Boylston production. It was written and edited by me, Tony Russo. Please subscribe wherever you are listening now. You can follow on Apple. You can ring the bell if you're on YouTube. We do have 2 to 3 podcasts that may come out on any given week. We do have every Friday, we have In Case You Missed It, which is also simulcast video on YouTube. And we have the occasional bonus episode on Wednesdays that is called Brief Introduction, and that's 10 minutes long, maybe 15. And then, of course, Funeral Service Insider, the podcast, which you are listening to now. That comes out every other Monday. If you have any suggestions for the show, people you'd like to hear, things you'd like to hear, things you'd like to say, you can leave me a voicemail. Just call 732-746-0233, extension 709. That is 732-746-0233, extension 09, and you can leave me a message. You can tell me if you don't want me to play the message back, and I won't. I will just take it under advisement, or I can play it back and respond to it on the show, whatever's best for you. And that's it for this week on Funeral Service Insider, the podcast.